Now, I read in a remarkable column today in the News Limited papers by my old mate Terry McCrann. Now, we know Chris Bowen's got this crusade on renewable energy. He condemns coal power and gas and seems fixated, as we know, on renewables. But you've got to ask a question. I'd love someone to sit down with Chris Bowen and ask him to answer honestly when faced with some of these facts. Now, we only need to look at the UK to understand what a renewable-dependent future would look like. Now, as Terry McCrann wrote today, this week in the UK, there was a demand of 24,000 megawatts to keep the lights on of energy. 14,700 of that was generated by gas. And how much was provided by solar and wind? 90 megawatts only. Joining me now to talk about this is the great Terry McCrann. Terry, you did the numbers. That was quite extraordinary. I mean, obviously the weather conditions were such that there was no wind and there's never much sun in the UK. So they were reliant on gas, but we're going to get rid of all that gas and coal.
Let me just take you through it, and the viewers, very simply, Steve. What we see in the UK, it laid out in crystal clear terms, is the absolute catastrophic disaster we are rushing to embrace, thanks to Chris Bowen and the Labor government more totally, and I have to say to some extent the opposition as well, who've really set the basis for all this. In the UK, they theoretically have enough wind installation to supply something like 70% of their power, with the one obvious proviso, provided the wind is blowing. When the wind isn't blowing, what do? They fire up these gas generators. They've got gas generation which is about equivalent to 8 or 9 Liddells, 8 or 9 Lawns in the Latrobe Valley in Victoria. Big power stations that can generate, as you say, 15,000 megawatts. They've also continued with nuclear. They've got some significant nuclear capacity. And they've also got something like 8 extension cords into various grids in Europe, which on Wednesday morning was pouring in something like 5,000 or 6,000 megawatts of power. Now, we're going to have none of that. We're going to have none of that. The Prime Minister's ruled nuclear off the table immediately. There's all sorts of objections to building gas-fired stations. We've got a couple, but nothing like anything which would cover any sort of significant demand. And of course, we have no power cords except to Tasmania. Who are we going to link up with? New Zealand, Indonesia? And as I wrote, maybe the moon. I mean, where if the wind is not blowing, when we've totally committed to this wind and solar future, if the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, where are we going to get the power from? It's as simple and reality and brutal and potentially catastrophic as that.
We've been having this argument for forever, it seems. I mean, it's cost a number of prime ministers their jobs. But what I can't quite work out, and I've interviewed Chris Bowen a couple of times a long time ago, but he seems to have been elected. He's in this position in the government, and he won't debate this. He'll hear no criticism of the road he's sending us down, which is just dangerous, isn't it?
Well, the whole approach seems to be, I'll just imagine that something will turn up, and that something that they expect to turn up is so-called green and blue hydrogen. But all of that again comes back to having wind towers generating electricity to turn that hydrogen into usable power. So again, it's hanging on this totally fantasy that somehow the wind will keep blowing. I mean, the argument is it'll keep blowing somewhere in Australia. So if we build enough wind towers, you'll be getting wind power. But what the UK has shown, right around the UK, it's not the size of Australia, obviously, but right around the UK, you can get a situation when the wind drops to zero. And when that happens, you get zero power.
Terry, you scared the hell out of me today. As usual, though, a brilliant column. Thanks for joining us tonight.